Hello, everyone. Welcome to God Without Filters. I'm Philippe Lecoin, and this is Greg Owens. Today, we are continuing our discussion on the end times, as some people call it, and we like to call it really the end of the old covenant age. We've already gone through our first series, which was called "What If Everything You've Heard of the End Times Is All Wrong?" And in that series, we discussed the Olivet Discourse. We discussed the end of the age, the sign of His coming, the tribulation, and what all that meant. We also started a series that's titled Revelation Finally Made Clear. And in that series, what we're doing is we're taking a few different characters, symbols, and making sense of it. The last one we did was the beast of Revelation. Specifically, it's the beast from the sea. And we ended that to make room today so that we can talk about the beast from the land. That's going to be a topic today. We have a few other ones to go through to bring a perspective to the whole story. And it's going to reveal more and more of the story of Revelation and as it relates to not only the Olivet Discourse, but everything that's talked about in the New Testament. So get ready. Here we go.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
So as we get into Revelation to talk about the beast from the land, we're first going to do a recap. We're going to do a recap of where we find ourselves in the beginning of Jesus' ministry. We're going to do a recap of Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse. We'll do a recap of Revelation as it relates to the way it was written. And we'll do a recap also of the beast from the sea, so that when we talk about the beast from the land, it's all going to make sense.
Yep.
As we head into Matthew 24, we want to look at where the people of God find themselves, especially as Jesus enters his ministry. What was really happening? What was the condition and the state of Israel at that time? We see that there's a few themes or topics that Jesus oftentimes is talking about in his teachings. You've got one, the rejection of the first century apostate Jerusalem, and that's because of what they had become with its Judaism. The Jews had departed from the original covenant of the law of Moses, which was that Torah-based faith, and they replaced it with religious practices and what Jesus called the doctrines of man. Another theme that Jesus talks about in his teachings is the coming judgment and the wrath of God on that generation that did not repent. Yet you also see God's justice in judging Jewish leaders and their followers for breaking covenant and even for putting Jesus to death. So these are different themes, different things that are that we understand as we get into the Olivet Discourse to make sense of it. We also see as a theme the disappearing of the Old Covenant era, which includes the Promised Land, the Temple, the sacrifices, and the removal of both the temple system and the dividing wall between God and man. And we see as part of the themes, the topics that Jesus talks about, the coming of the new covenant era through Jesus Christ. And finally, the continual victory of Christ and of his saints and of his kingdom in the new covenant.
Yeah, that's right. It's quite a lot of things that Jesus is shaking up. And just by way of reminder, as we said, to kind of review some of the things we talked about, but we kind of want to emphasize and kind of convey to our listeners that, the stories in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and then the book of Revelation, the things we're going to talk about there, they're not like wildly separate things. They're actually very congruent, and we're going to talk about how they intersect in time, in like real factual history and with the scriptures, and how what Jesus said was going to happen in Matthew 24, for example. Remember he was pointing out to his disciples that that the temple was going to be destroyed, that not one stone would be left upon another. It was going to happen in their generation. It's not going to happen in some future generation. It's not going to happen in our generation. It's already happened. It happened there. Jesus gave them careful instructions about, hey, here, there's lots of things are going to happen leading up to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. He talked about, famines and earthquakes and wars, and he talked about, persecutions and false prophets and people doing signs and wonders, false prophets doing those kind of things. And so in the book of Revelation, we believe that John had this experience in Revelation probably in around AD 64, 65, and the temple was destroyed in AD 70. And so this is all first century stuff. It's all current events. And if you're living in the first century, these are things you're going to be watching.
That's right. And we don't want to be spooked out by these words that we hear when Jesus talked about the sign of his coming, because the disciples asked about that. Again, it's the end of the age of the old covenant and the coming in of the new covenant era. And so Jesus is giving all these signs as it pertains to this actually happening. And it's like you said, Greg, I mean, you hear about famines, you hear about persecutions. Jesus is warning them, look, persecution is coming. People are going to fall away. He's saying lawlessness is going to increase. He's giving all these signs, but he's encouraging the disciples also to endure, because the Lord was going to bring the saints to victory.
Yeah.
And it's not to victory when they die and go to heaven, victory in this lifetime, in their lifetime.
Yes.
And it would protect and save. That's what Jesus would do. He would protect and save his covenant people from this coming judgment, from this coming persecution. Even to the point where Jesus said that the whole gospel will be preached to the entire world, which at that time, it meant to the Jews and to the Gentiles, and it meant to what was known back then as the entire Roman Empire.
Right. The inhabited world of their time.
That's right. That's right.
Oike Meno, something like that.
That's right.
Oike Mene. Probably butchered that.
No, you're a Greek master.
Right.
And so Jesus then explains the abomination of desolation, which means the curse that would bring devastation to Jerusalem and to the temple, even according to Daniel 9.
Right. And so as we get into this, we will kind of, look at the scriptures, both from maybe the Olivet Discourse, but now we're going to kind of transition more into John's view of things. So the way I kind of think about John's revelation is that Jesus appeared to him, fell at his face as a dead man, and Jesus basically said, come up here, I want to show you some things. And so what you have to keep in mind is John is not on an acid trip, writing stuff down out of his own imagination. He's caught up in the Spirit, and God himself, who uses all these vivid images, and he was the same God who inspired the prophets. We've talked about the fact that, like the thing you just said, the sign of his coming. That's a phrase that the prophets used usually when it meant God was coming in judgment. And you've got several, we covered some of those. And so, back to my original thought, John is caught up in heaven, and God is speaking to John and giving him all these vivid visions, and he's given him like this. It's an unveiling. That's what apocalypse or revelation means. It's an unveiling. And so God is kind of taking John up and saying, hey, he's saying basically, John, here's how I'm seeing all these things that are happening and have happened. Here's how I want you to perceive this from heaven's viewpoint. And it's powerful. It's otherworldly. It's, but it's also very integrated to, what Jesus said was going to happen. These very epic, prophetic, or these judgments were going to happen as kind of the world then was marching towards a judgment that God had pronounced against the covenant people of Israel at that time.
Yes. And looking at Matthew, at Luke, and at Mark, those Gospels talk about the Olivet Discourse. It's interesting that it's not in the Gospel of John, but John has reserved an entire book, an entire letter for the whole topic. In the Olivet Discourse, Jesus tells the disciples that the devastation would happen when Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. And at that time, the disciples would need to flee the region and away from Jerusalem to escape. And this is what we've already covered to be the tribulation that happened when Rome sieged Jerusalem in 70 AD, in which all kinds of wicked and just awful atrocities came upon the apostate Jews of the time that had not repented and had not listened and took heed to the word of Jesus, who prophesied, look, when you see the armies, make sure you get out. And when we read Revelation, we're going to see this parallel account. It's just going to be described differently, but we're going to see these armies coming. We're going to see that how all of this is coming down.
Right. And one of the things we talked about, Philippe, kind of offline, was kind of identifying the characters in this true story. It's not a fairy tale. But so we have various beasts mentioned in the book of Revelation. We have a false prophet. We have a harlot. We have Babylon. We have this cast of characters, you might say. And some of them actually are the same individuals. They're just painted, with a different name, because God wants to emphasize another, basically indictment against that same person. So we talked about the beast from the sea and how that was the Roman Empire as it kind of geographically emerges up out of the Mediterranean Sea. And then we talked about Nero, who was Caesar, who embodied the Roman Empire. And so, Revelation sort of refers to both the Roman Empire as the beast from the sea and also Nero as the beast. It kind of interchangeably, pivots between those two, but they're very much aligned because for all practical purposes, he is the empire. When you encounter Nero, you encounter the Roman Empire.
That's right, Greg. And so going back to Matthew 24, this is the army that comes upon Jerusalem in order to bring the tribulation.
Right. And maybe you could argue that tribulation started maybe before that with maybe Nero's persecution of, but yeah, you're right. It totally culminates in, what Jesus referred to as the abomination of desolation. And people, that sounds so spooky to us in modern day. And, I guess it is, it is kind of strange term, but the Bible tells us what the term means. In fact, if you look in Luke's gospel, for example, in the Olivet Discourse, Luke is actually a little more descriptive, and he says, when you see the abomination of desolation, it means, basically that this is the circling of the armies around Jerusalem. He tells you exactly what it means. It's not some future wild thing to happen in our future. It's something that happened then. And so Jesus when he was warning his guys about what was coming, he told them, he said, when you see the armies of Rome circling the city, then you don't go back and get your cloak or go back and get this, that, or the other. Get out of the city and leave, because it's, you're not going to be able to leave after that point, and then, destruction is going to come, suddenly like a flood upon Jerusalem and the temple.
And then through celestial symbols, Jesus shows how the old covenant era was ending. That's what all these things about the sun and the moon is all about. And from there, we also see the sign that Jesus, the Son of Man, is in heaven, and that's that he's releasing his judgment upon that nation. And it kind of ends in Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, and we see this clear in other places of the New Testament as well. But it says, and it's clearly indicated, that first century generation would not pass away until everything Jesus said would happen. And
Right.
that kind of caps that Olivet Discourse.
Right. And so now I think when we transition to Revelation, it's covering the same current events of that first century time period, the really in particular the years, coming up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
That's right. So let's talk about Revelation a little bit more. We've kind of touched on it. Big picture of Revelation, it's there to provide encouragement to the saints at the time. I mean, you get oracles or letters to various churches very close to where John is at the time. And it's also a revealing of how everything was going to go down, because the time was now at hand and quickly approaching, is what Revelation tells us. So a couple of, again, the themes or topics we want to keep in our mind as we read Revelation is what it was about. And it was like the Olivet Discourse. And you've got a few things we want to point out. One is it was the accusations against the Jewish religious authorities in Jerusalem who had rejected Christ. This is one of the themes that you see there. And you see God's judgment of that nation and the judgment even of the temple by destruction, and this through the Jewish war specifically, using the Roman army, and as we'll see later, Vespasian, but then Titus completing the job with the siege of Jerusalem. Another thing we want to keep in mind as we go into Revelation is it's really about also the final and permanent historical removal of the Jewish temple and of the old covenant sacrificial system. It was also the end of the Jewish and Roman persecutions against the saints, and the encouragement for the Christians was a confirmation to them, saying, "Look, Christ is reigning. You are the faithful one, and you are reigning with Christ." And that's kind of overall themes of Revelation and what Revelation is really about. So as we read it and as we read these characters, we can start putting them in their places.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great kind of overview of Revelation. And another thing that I like to think about in Revelation, as far as kind of a big picture view of this, is that if you think back to Daniel's prophecies in the book of Daniel, he talks about 4 kingdoms and 4 beasts. And it's funny, remember we said, when you hear these terms, where else did I hear that, And so in Daniel, like, for example, in Revelation, we're going to talk about, where we did talk about the beast from the sea, and then we'll talk a little bit about the beast from the land and who, all that. But Daniel also used beast language. He talked about 4 kingdoms, and he kind of compared them to beast. And then the 4th one was like, had teeth of iron and nails of bronze and all that. And like you said, the good news is that Daniel shows he explains he interprets his dream as with the 4 kingdoms and how those kingdoms would fall. And then he talks about how in Daniel 7, how the Son of Man, he says, I saw one like the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And it's always great to point out, which way is he going? In Daniel's vision, he's coming up. He's coming up to the Ancient of Days, and it says that, and we know that's Jesus. We talked about how Jesus himself told the high priest, he said, you will see the Son of Man, coming on the clouds of heaven. And that priest, I think, knew what that meant, that Jesus was telling him, hey, I'm actually God, and I'm going to ascend and come into I'm the Son of Man and the Son of God. I'm going to come into my kingdom. And that's what Daniel saw, and he prophesied it. And then also what he saw Jesus coming into his kingdom, because he was, Daniel was hundreds of years before, but he's looking in time through eternity, with God's help, and he's seeing Jesus coming into his kingdom. And then he's seeing, Daniel also is seeing, the Ancient of Days seated, and, he sees the myriads of angels worshiping. He sees the it says the court was seated and the books were open. And a lot of people confuse that with, wow, that must be, the end of time or the end of eternity judgment or whatever, the great white throne judgment or something. But it's really not. It's really, he's looking forward into this first century, this book of Revelation that we're talking about. He's looking into all these pivotal, epic things that are happening. Jesus is becoming king and taking his kingdom, and all the kingdoms of this earth are going to be subject to him. And these early century, first century saints, under this intense persecution, remember, this is all new. I mean, these are the first Christians who've ever lived, and so they're coming into persecution. They're crying out to God, and so they're getting this revelation that their God, their King, is Jesus sitting in heaven, and he's got his own kingdom, and he actually hears and answers prayer. And that's what Daniel is seeing hundreds of years before, is that, wow, this Son of Man is coming into his kingdom, and I see his people receiving his kingdom and possessing his kingdom. And that's all the epic turmoil. It's victorious turmoil, but it's extremely intense that these saints are going through. And that's what John is describing a lot in Revelation.
Yes, he is. That's very good, Greg. And so we talked about the beast from the sea last time. We want to recap that as we get into the beast from the land. And it's just like you said. I mean, if we now reread Revelation and we understand that what you just said from Daniel, it's brought back alive in Revelation. To kind of go through what you went through on the beast that comes from the sea, get the picture, right, for our audience. Just get this picture and understand what just Greg said, and it all fits together. We talked about a woman that gave birth to a child, and we understand that child, that was Jesus at the time. The dragon trying to devour the child, that was the devil, that's Satan, talked about in those passages. And what we see is the child Jesus escapes, and the dragon, Satan, wages war against the woman's offerings, which we see as the saints. And then we see this beast rising out of the sea, which we've already described and explained before. It's the Roman Empire coming out of the Mediterranean Sea from Italy, if you will. Rome's 10 horns are its 10 provincial kings who will go to war later with the Jews, we're going to come to show. Rome is also known as the city of seven hills, but specifically the seven heads that are talked about in Revelation are actually seven emperors.
Yep.
And we kind of go through those, but the beast is both the Roman Empire and the Roman Caesars, as you've already said, Greg. And Rome's blasphemous names was actually its emperor worship. It's claimed that the Caesars were gods. Rome is defined in beast-like language similar to Daniel 7, this as you noted. But what's really important here is the Daniel 7 prophecy is sealed because
Right.
the time was in the distant future.
Right.
But we know here that the prophecy is not sealed. It's opened up because the Holy Spirit tells John the time is near and it's quickly coming.
Right. That was a great point I was thinking I would make earlier and forgot to make it. But exactly, Daniel's told in his day, he sees all this magnificent stuff happening, and he's looking forward into what we're talking about now. But the angel says, seal all this up because it's not time. But then, like you said, John says, the angel tells him, this is to be unsealed because now is the time. It is actually happening.
What we see with regards to the beast is it has a mortal wound, which represents the weakening of the Roman Empire. Now, we broke all this down on our last episode, but quickly here, the sixth head we know is Nero Caesar, died in AD 68. Thereafter, 3 other Caesars tried to take power, but they're all killed. And so at that point, it looked like the empire, the beast, was actually dying. We see thereafter, though, the wound is healed when the seventh head, which we know now to be Emperor Vespasian, successfully comes to power. And as Revelation writes it, The beast therefore recovers. And so, get the big picture here. Though the sixth head, which is Nero Caesar, was gone, the seventh head, which was Vespasian, was now alive. So Rome continues, Rome recovers. But also, we want to put into perspective that at the very time of the writing, John says the one who is Nero Caesar.
Right.
And this Nero Caesar had been given authority for 42 months and was allowed to make war on the saints. Again, this is that Revelation account. This is the persecution of Nero Caesar between 64 AD until his death in June of AD 68. That persecution came from the prompting of prominent Jewish religious figures that we've already seen. And then the number of the beasts we explained of Nero.
Yeah. Was it Neron, Caesar, or something like that? And yeah, when you put those letters out in the ancient Hebrew, there's a mathematical value assigned to those letters, and it adds up to 666.
That's right. And we finished off talking about the beast from the sea by showing how when Nero Caesar dies, Emperor Vespasian takes over. He's the seventh head. And then there's an eighth king that shows up, which tells us in Revelation he's going to war. He's part of the seventh. And we realize, okay, this is Titus, the son of Vespasian, who ends up completing the siege against Jerusalem to bring the final tribulation and the destruction of that city.
Yeah.
And that's kind of where we ended up talking about the beast that came from the sea.
Yep. Okay, let's talk about the beast from the land, Revelation 13. Maybe start in verse 11 and 12. John writes, "Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had two horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. It exercises all the authority of the first beast," which we said was Rome or Nero, "in its presence, and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast, whose mortal wound was healed."
That's right. So we already know who the first beast is. We already have that down packed. It's the Roman Empire, represented by the nation of Rome or the Roman Caesars. So we can check that box. Let's talk about that word earth, because it's really going to have a big part in how we bring interpretation to this passage and others. And that word earth is really best translated as land. All in Scripture, really, whenever we see the words tribes and the word land together, it's referring to the children of Israel and also the land of Israel. I mean, you can think back, the promised land that was promised to Abraham, right, by God. And everything in the beginning stages of coming into their inheritance had to do with them getting into the promised land. And once they were in the promised land, it was their covenantal land. And so whenever you see the word land being used in the Jewish writings, it's really synonymous to the tribes of Israel. So that becomes important because now you can really identify these characters a lot easier, especially as it relates to prophetic text. And also, I would say when the tribes of Israel were established in the promised land, everything revolved around that land. Then you see Jerusalem being established. You see the temple being established, and their culture, everything that they revolved around was the promised land that had been given to them. And so when you can even look at Matthew 24:30, that can kind of give also a little bit more emphasis on this word of tribes and land. It says in Matthew 24:30, "Then will appear the sign that the Son of Man is in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn." This is saying all the tribes. We know the tribe is always the nation of Israel. It's all the tribes. of the nation of Israel. It says, all the tribes of the land will mourn, of that promised land, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. We even see in Revelation 1:7, because all this continually ties together, it says, behold, he is coming with the clouds. This is the judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And every eye will see him, even those who pierced him. Who were those who pierced him? The ones in that first century.
Right.
And all the tribes of the land will mourn over him. So the land was very important. Even if you read Deuteronomy 28, the blessings and the curses, a lot of them had to do with the land, that God would bless the Israelites in the land that the Lord your God had given you. And he even says in the curses that when they disobeyed, the enemies would besiege all your cities throughout the land that the Lord your God has given you. So what is it saying? It's saying this. When you saw another beast rising out of the land, it's saying that this beast is rising out of Jerusalem. It's rising out of Judea. It's rising out of that promised land. And later, it's going to talk about the earth and its inhabitants. It's going to be the land and its inhabitants. It's going to be the land and who are its inhabitants. As it relates to this passage, it's the Jewish people.
Right. Yeah. And it says that the land and its inhabitants worship the first beast. They're going to be, enticing others to worship that first beast, and that's going to be, even more severe part of their judgment. So let's maybe talk about how they did that. It says that the other beast out of the land had 2 horns, emphasizing that his authority is derived from the beast with 10 horns, had the appearance of a lamb, but it spoke like a dragon. And Jesus actually talked a little bit about this. He said in Matthew 7, beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves, and you will recognize them by their fruits. And so this lamb, spoke like a dragon, means they spoke like the devil. Jesus, again, if we go back to his testimony against these apostate Jewish folks in the first century, he said to the Pharisees, he said in John chapter 8, 44, you, the Pharisees, are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desire. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. The reason you do not hear them, the words of God, is that you are not of God. And so the land beast appears like a devout lamb, but really is inwardly a ravenous wolf who's, not following God. Is actually, Jesus said, their father is the father of lies, or Satan, speaking like a dragon.
Precisely, Greg. And so the Jewish priesthood and the religious leaders, we know they constantly bore false witness against the Christians, as we read even in Acts. Throughout Acts, you see, and even other places in the New Testament, that these apostate Jews, they persecuted the church. They were inciting the crowds against the saints. They were arresting them. They were falsely accusing them and bringing them up in the Roman courts. And so, like you said, they were deceiving, they were profaning, they were slandering, accusing, and they spoke like the dragon.
Yeah, and that's, I think as a first century believer, you'd be, if you were living in Rome or part of the Roman Empire, especially in Jerusalem prior to destruction, I mean, you're going to be persecuted. Those early believers were, tormented, or like you said, constantly being brought before the authorities and falsely accused, and that's who Satan is he's the accuser of the brethren. And that was the warfare, the spiritual warfare these new believers were encountering, constantly being drug up and, falsely accused, maybe beaten, whipped, imprisoned, some even put to death. That Jesus, prophesied that in the Olivet Discourse. And so we'll read a few examples of this when we see the Jewish leaders were aligning themselves with Rome, totally against what God was doing. And so we see in John 19, verse 12, this is, when Jesus is brought before Pilate, it says, "From then on, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, 'If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend.'" Notice they're appealing to Caesar. "Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So right in the midst of Jesus being crucified, they're using Roman authority and aligning themselves with Caesar. And so John 19, again, further down, it says, "They cried out, 'Away with him, crucify him.' Pilate said to them, 'Shall I crucify your king?' The chief priest answered, 'We have no king but Caesar.' So he delivered him over them to be crucified." So that's that's a real definitive statement to say you've got it's the utter blasphemy. You've got Jesus, the Son of God, right there, and you are attempting to crucify him and get your hands on him, and you're aligning yourself with Caesar.
That's amazing.
Yeah, to get this wicked thing done.
That's amazing. Yeah, the Jews were forsaking the Lord God Almighty by submitting to a pagan king that claimed to be God. I mean, we have no king but Caesar. That's pretty scary. Even in Acts 17, we see Jews dragging some of the apostles to city authorities. Again, there, I think you mentioned it, the men have turned the world upside down and have come here also, and they are acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus. This goes on, but it's quite amazing. The summary of that passage in Revelation is, again, the beast from the land exercising all the authority of the beast from the sea, are the Jewish leaders of that time exercising all the authority of Rome. And they did so by uniting with them. They accused the Christians of treason, law-breaking, disrupting society. The Jews made the Christians essentially an enemy of Rome. They really instigated a lot of the persecutions that we see later. Even in Acts 21:28, Paul's trials shows an ongoing collaboration between Jewish opposition and Roman power. And this culminates all the way to when Nero started his great persecution against the Christians in AD 64,
right,
which was actually fueled by Jewish accusations.
Right, and I think that relates to I think there was a great fire in AD 64 in Rome, and much of the city burned down, and I think historical writers tell us that Nero, he was wicked anyway, but I think he was kind of, I think the apostate Jews actually continued to stir up strife against the Christians and inspired Nero to, go after these Christians and even blame the fire of Rome on Christians.
Absolutely. We can move on to Revelation 13 and 14. This beast from the land. It says it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of the people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on earth, telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. So now, let's bring some clarity to this. I think this can really throw off a lot of people. Now, although we see some false prophets performing great signs in the first century, and Jesus talked about that, specifically here, we are talking about the beast from the land. The beast from the land is performing great signs, even making fire. So that's the proper context. It's the Jewish high priesthood, the beast from the land, performing great signs. So what we want to see here is, historically, we know that sacrifices were offered up twice a day for Caesar and also for the Roman people. This was done on what we call God's heaven-fired altar. They were replacing God's holy fire with profane, strange, what you read about in scripture, forbidden fire.
Right.
And I just recommend people to read things like Leviticus 9, verse 24, to understand God's heaven-fired altar, and then looking at Numbers 3, verse 4, to get a perspective on forbidden fire. But it had essentially changed that sacrificial system to now offering up sacrifices for the sake of this pagan nation.
Yeah, it's actually unbelievable. And we, again, kind of going back to Matthew, when we talk about what Jesus was prophesying was going to happen, and then we see actually it actually is happening. In Matthew 24, verse 24, it says, "For false Christs and false prophets will arise and perform great signs and wonders, so as to lead astray, even, if possible, even the elect." And then we see later in the New Testament, book of Acts, chapter 8, there was a man named Simon who had previously practiced magic in the city and amazed the people of Samaria, saying that he himself was somebody great. In Acts 13, Paul confronted a certain magician, a Jewish false prophet named Bar Jesus. And so, again, this is not, Jew bashing or anything. This is just historical fact. And like we've said before, the early Christians were Jews. They embraced Jesus wholeheartedly. Jesus' disciples were all Jewish, so we're for all of them. But we're just saying, as a matter of historical fact, the early Jewish folks, the ones who did not follow Jesus, there was a set, unfortunately, that actually held seats of religious authority in that system that totally rejected Jesus. We saw it in the trial, the crucifixion, and then the later persecution of the early disciples. We see this continual aligning, and that's what John is talking about. And remember, what John is talking about isn't John's opinion. He's been caught up to heaven, and this is God's opinion. God is saying, "Hey, John, you're my scribe, if you will. You're my prophet, and I want you to record and give the vision of how I see this, and this is how God sees this." He's calling. God is the one using this language. He's calling the Roman Empire and Nero the beast, and from the sea, and he's calling what was once his covenant people and now no longer. He's given these judgmental terms. This is God speaking, not John. He's saying, "Hey, these people they appear like a lamb, but they're really, a dragon. They're really a ravenous wolf, and they're the beast from the land." And then we'll get into other names of the same guilty party, the false prophet and, Babylon and the great harlot and all that stuff. These are all God's judgmental words and language that God is using, and John is merely recording and telling us about it.
Yes, he is. This beast from the land is a passage religious Jewish hierarchy, we can say. And this beast from the land deceives those who dwell in the land. So going back to what we've already talked about, those who dwell in the land, that's synonymous with the Israelites who live in the promised land at that time. So what this means is that they deceived the Jewish people. How did they deceive them? Deceiving them into thinking everything was well. At that time, the temple service and the religious rituals, they were now deceptive, and they were no longer functioning as God's blessing. I mean, they had rejected the Messiah. They had rejected Jesus. So they essentially were abolishing their covenant by rejecting Christ. The temple system was obsolete in John's day. As we read in Hebrews 8:13, it was ready to disappear, because it says there, Hebrews 8:13, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So the beast from the land, the Jewish high priesthood, told those who dwell in the land to make an image for the beast. What does that mean? Well, we know historically the Jews resisted any kind of idolatrous images in the temple. So what was really happening here? They were committing spiritual idolatry with their God, which is represented here as Caesar, and his God, which is ultimately Satan. And what they do is they deceive the people into doing the very same thing. I mean,
Hmm.
if you look again at what we covered earlier, there's three characters here involved. It's the dragon, it's the beast from the sea, and it's the beast from the land, representing Satan, representing Rome, and now representing apostate Israel at the time.
So why don't we move on to Revelation 13:15? And it says, and it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak, and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. And in maybe this is a funny way of looking at it, but I kind of see like almost you've got the Roman Empire, and they didn't have microphones back then, but they're kind of speaking with authority, you might say. And then you've got apostate Israel sort of taking the mic, so to speak. I'm just using a metaphor, but taking the mic and speaking to their own people with the voice of Rome, and aligning themselves and think about, and this is, remember now, this, all that we're seeing in Revelation is God is seeing all this and judging all this, and he's telling John, this is what's happened. This is how I see this. This is how evil and egregious this is. I've brought the Messiah here, and you've killed him, persecuting all the new wineskin followers of Jesus, and now you're aligning yourself with this wicked, evil Roman Empire that killed my son and persecutes my followers, and you're aligning yourself. You're a covenant, supposed to be a covenant-keeping people, and you're aligning yourself with Rome, and now even seducing other people on the land, other Israelites, and seducing them into the same delusion and the same evil. And it's like, it's like too much.
That's right, Greg. And the Jewish high priesthood and its temple spoke as the image of the beast. There's two letters or oracles in Revelations to the churches that I think are very relevant, where it shows that apostate Jews had become a synagogue of Satan, an assembly of Satan. In Revelations 2:9, it says, I know your affliction and your poverty, though you're rich. I am aware of the slander of those who falsely claim to be Jews, but are in fact a synagogue of Satan. And he says something similar to another church, Revelation 3:9. As for those who belong to the synagogue of Satan, who claim to be Jews but are liars instead, I will make them come and bow down at your feet, and they will know that I love you. This just fits right into everything we've been talking about and the judgment that's ultimately going to come on that generation. The end of that Revelation 13, verse 15 passage says that the beast of the land might cause those who would not worship the image of the other beast to be slain. Even Jesus warned us in John 16:2. Indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God.
All right, so let's get into the mark of the beast. Such a wonderful prophecy watcher kind of a topic, isn't it? Everybody's got their own opinion about what that is. I mean, it's crazy. But let's go back to the Bible. Let's keep our rules of the road in mind. So Revelation 13:16 says, and also it causes, talking about the beast from the land, causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead. Verse 17, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name. And so what we have here is this figure of speech, this idea of being marked on the right hand or the forehead. Remember, these are all kind of Old Testament illusions that John is referencing here. And so we know from Old Testament scripture that the priest was marked on his forehead with, I think, in gold, holy to the Lord. And we know from back in Ezekiel, it talks about those will be this saints then of the holy ones would be marked on their right hand and their forehead with the law of God, and that would ensure God's protection. And so these are actually, these are biblical ideas, that instructions that were carried out in the Old Testament. So remember, God is kind of using, in a way you might say sarcasm, but it's kind of the way he sees this. He's saying, hey, look, you were the people of God. You were my people. You understand about marks on the right hand and the forehead. It means consecration, holy to the Lord. And here you have turned 180 degrees, and now, apostate Israel, you aligned yourself with this beast, this false god, and you're using your knowledge that I gave you, and in a totally absolute, abhorrent, perverted way to cause people to want to follow this beast, this Roman Empire, this emperor worship false god of the Roman Empire, and you're insisting on, the people of God, having this mark. You're insisting on total obedience and consecration, not to me, the real God, but to this false state god, this state religion of Rome, and even to the point in verse 17 of Revelation 13, it says that no one can buy or sell unless he has a mark. And so this is indicating, Israel aligning with Rome to forbid the saints, these new believers, from buying or selling. It's an economic sort of boycott. It's to shut them out of the marketplace. It's to starve them. And that's kind of what's going on here. It's not something in the future. It's a thing that it's an indictment that God is saying, hey, you guys are guilty of actually aligning yourselves with Rome to the extent of total dedication to Rome, such that remember, they were shouting, we have no king but Caesar. They've totally given themselves over to Caesar and Rome worship. No more God of, not the Messiah's God. No, we're aligned with Rome now, and we're going to shut these new believers out, and we're going to stiff them from the marketplace, and we don't really care what happens to them.
Yeah, that's right on, Greg. And so let's see this as a spiritual marking. We also read in Revelation 7:3, there's a spiritual marking on the saints, wherein it says, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. So the spiritual marking is everywhere. The Lord shows that the mark on the people talked about in Revelation 13:16, right, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead with this mark of this beast of Rome. It shows that the mark on these people is really their allegiance to Caesar, the beast from the sea. It's a political loyalty.
Right.
Essentially, it's religious apostasy. That has now become their mark.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. It's not a literal mark. You've heard all kinds of crazy stories about, embedded microchips and all kinds of stuff. But remember, you keep yourself in context. It's not a literal mark. It's just a language that means devotion and commitment. And so, yeah, I think it's great to point out.
And it's key also to remember that this deception came from the beast of the land, right? The Jewish high priesthood. It's what deceived the people of the land, the Jews of the land. By the way, Greg, do you remember, was it Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union? Remember he had a big birthmark?
Yeah.
Did not people think that he was
right
the beast, that was the mark of the beast right there?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
But he died,
Right.
so they had to pick somebody else.
Yeah. All this futuristic speculation has been going on for literally decades and decades and centuries and centuries. Every time, every generation, they read this and they they leave the boundaries of Scripture and context and go launching out into contemporary society and start speculating on all kinds of things that could happen. Yeah.
Anyhow, back to our previously scheduled program.
Yes.
So I totally agree also with what you said about, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark. That shows the thread of excommunication.
Yeah.
Religious banishment would impact the livelihood of all these people. I mean, just imagine too that if you go into a country where Christians are persecuted, I mean, their life is hard. Places where their Christianity is not protected, you see them being run out of town. You
Yeah.
see them being murdered. You see, even in many cases, same thing. Their businesses being denied. Just a lot of opposition economically, and you see this also in the scriptures. You had the poverty of the Smyrnian Christians, and that was caused by Jewish persecution. You can also read in Hebrews 10:32 through 34, it said there that they were chased out of their towns, they were arrested, and they had their property seized. So we can see here what happens when Christianity was thriving, but the opposition that was coming from the Jewish authorities and resisting them and what came upon them in terms of financial hardship.
Right. And I was going to say that's happened and even happens today. And it's happened, in periods of history all the way back to this.
Yeah, so from here, the land beast is no longer mentioned as the land beast, but it's being mentioned by other names.
Yes.
So we're kind of in a place where we have to end abruptly. But on our next episode, what we want to do is we want to bring in the false prophet, and we want to bring in the great prostitute. And we want to kind of bring the whole story to completion as far as the characters involved are concerned, so that as we understand this whole story, when we reread the New Testament, whether it's the Olivet Discourse, the New Testament, what have you, or Revelation, we can see now the big picture and everything can start to make sense again.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's good to point out that these characters in this real true story, it's actually the same entity, but it's kind of given a different name. And sort of the way I think about that, if you think about it, say you have a guy who's, say he's, no offense to Jack Smith, I'm just using a name, Jack Smith. So what if you said, we've got this defendant, Jack Smith, he's kidnapped someone, he has counterfeited some money, and he's also killed someone. So a prosecutor who's bringing the charges against Jack Smith, he might, in order to keep the jury's mind separate on the three tracks of, criminality, he might say, well, let's talk about Jack Smith, the kidnapper. And then here's what Jack did as the kidnapper. And then he'd say, well, counterfeiting is a different set of crimes. So he's going to say, well, let's talk about Jack Smith, the counterfeiter. What did Jack Smith do here? Okay, well, now let's talk about Jack Smith, the murderer. Okay, and what murders did he commit, and how did he do that? So it's the same person, but he's got three labels. He's a kidnapper, he's a counterfeiter, and he's a murderer. So you kind of have that in the book of Revelation. You have, this beast from the land. You've got false prophet. Actually, I guess there's maybe four characters. I mean, there's Babylon, there's the harlot. So we sort of have, these things are relevant because this is how God sees his people, because that's how he can see all through the prophetic language. God is inspiring the prophets, and he's drawing on that history. There was a real Babylon and all that. in the past. So God is kind of indicting his first century apostate people with labels that mean something. They mean prophetic things. They mean significant things. And he's using that imagery, but it's really the same guilty party, but they just have different crimes and different labels. And God is very thorough. He's wrapping this whole thing together, and he's using John to do it.
That's spot on, Greg. And the accusations are escalating, and the judgment is coming. So stay tuned for our next episode where we complete the story.